Hi, everybody. I'm Mark Zinni. Thank you so much for joining us live right now. We are streaming live on the Channel 3 Facebook page. As you know, all week long from 6:30 to 7, we have been answering your questions about the coronavirus vaccine, any of your concerns you've been bringing to us. We have been sitting down and bringing those questions directly to local doctors. Remember, you can still submit more questions anytime. It's very easy to do. If you have the Channel 3 app, you can do it right through the app. If you don't have the app, it's very easy to find in your app store. Send them our way that way. You can also comment below right here under this Facebook video, and we will be checking out the comments during our broadcast. You can also call the number 860-244-1790. Again, 860-244-1790. We will be checking that out as well. But joining us right now is Dr. David Banach, an infectious disease physician and the hospital epidemiologist at UConn Health. Dr. Banach, thank you so much for joining us right now. We appreciate it.
Thanks for having me on.
Can I start, sir, by asking you, talk a little bit about what you do. What is your role there at UConn Health?
Sure. So I have a few roles at UConn Health. I'm a physician. I'm an infectious disease specialist. In that role, I take care of patients with different infections, including patients with COVID-19 in the hospital. I also have a role in our infection prevention program. I'm the medical leader for our program, and that program basically has the focus on protecting our patients and our staff at UConn Health from infection. And I've also had a role in our vaccine program. I've been one of the clinical leaders of our COVID-19 vaccine program at UConn Health as well.
Well, then you can certainly answer a lot of these questions because it sounds like you have been right there on the front line for the past year. Kind of take me back, when you look at where we've gone over the past year, from first talking about this virus coming from China to where we are now. What have you seen at UConn Health? What have you experienced?
Well, geez, it's been quite a journey over the past year. I think when we think about what things looked like last February and March is when we had our first patient with COVID-19 in the hospital. There was, a lot of unknowns. There was a lot of fear. We knew that there was this virus that was causing people to be really sick, particularly our vulnerable patients, older patients, were becoming quite ill. We didn't really have an understanding of it. And as time has gone on, we've learned a lot more about how the virus is spread, what we can do to protect ourselves from the virus. We've learned a lot about how to treat patients with treatments that have evidence that support them. Now that we've had multiple studies that have shown which treatments work, which treatments may not work as well. We've come a long way with our personal protective equipment in the hospital. If you recall in the spring, that was a real challenge, meeting the supply and our needs. So we've come a long way with that. And I think in terms of our public health measures, we've learned a lot about how to protect ourselves when we're in different environments in the public. A lot of that is the masking, the distancing. And now that we've moved into a new phase with the COVID-19 vaccine, which I think is really going to be what we need to really turn the corner on COVID-19.
Boy, that is for sure. And I know there are several key things that you want to talk about, and I want to get to all of these things. We have a lot of great questions as well from viewers, so I know that we want to make sure we get as many answered as we can. Can we talk first, Doctor, about the safety of the vaccine and how effective it is?
So, I think the two vaccines that we have available right now, which are the mRNA vaccines, the Pfizer and Moderna vaccines, have demonstrated a really robust efficacy and really incredible safety. So in terms of their efficacy, we hear this 95% efficacy number rolling around, and that's really both of those vaccines perform at that level. And what that really tells us is that those vaccines are extremely effective in preventing illness from COVID-19. So someone who receives the vaccine, the chance of them becoming ill from COVID-19 is dramatically diminished. And hospitalization almost protective 100%. So, I think on an individual basis, these vaccines are extremely protective, and that's going to be really important in protecting the health of all of us, particularly our vulnerable individuals at higher risk for hospitalization. In terms of safety profile, the phase 3 clinical trials really speak for themselves. We saw, a very favorable safety profile in terms of adverse events. Really, mostly localized inflammation at the site of the injection. Some percentage of the population, even upwards of, say about 20 to 30%, had some generalized symptoms afterwards: fatigue, some muscle aches. And that's to be expected with a vaccine that's really very immune stimulating. And what those symptoms really represent is the body's response to the vaccine. It doesn't necessarily reflect, that there's any health risk per se, but it's really your body cranking out those antibodies, making those protective immune cells that are going to keep you safe if you ever were exposed down the road. So, I think that the secondary effects that we're seeing are really a reflective of how potent these vaccines really are and how protective they are.
I'm seeing people here on our Facebook page, and I've seen this before, Doctor, where people say they created this vaccine too quickly. I'm not going to take it because it happened so fast. What are your thoughts on that?
So, I think it's incredible that we got to the point where we have a vaccine available literally less than a year after the discovery of this virus. And so it's really remarkable. But I think when we look at the accelerated path that was taken to get here, I think it's important to really look at which parts were most accelerated. It was really the early phase where we were able to really invest and able to do the rapid genetic sequencing of the virus, the rapid development of these mRNA vaccines using that sequencing, and really amping up the speed at which we could produce the product that we needed. The important part is the phase 3 clinical trial where the vaccine was really studied. That wasn't accelerated. That was really done with a really stringent and very robust, robust clinical trial, which was really done with such a meticulous level of detail, which is really what we needed to demonstrate that these vaccines are effective and safe. So that part wasn't accelerated. It was really the rapidity at which we invested in the development, and now the investment that we've made in really ramping up our production to meet an incredible demand. And I think that's where we've made the investments that's really moved this along so quickly.
You got the vaccine?
I did. I got my second dose of the vaccine. It was over a month ago now.
I'm assuming you know which one you got. Did you have any side effects yourself?
So I personally received the Pfizer vaccine. That was what we had available at UConn Health when we first started offering vaccine. And my story is very boring. I got my first dose.
I'm okay with boring, Doctor.
I felt fine. I felt fine afterwards. After the second dose, I'll confess, I had some soreness, lasted about maybe like 8 or 12 hours. But I didn't get the symptoms that other folks had in terms of the fatigue. And, some folks have had some achiness, even some low-grade fevers afterwards. I didn't experience any of that myself. But I have some colleagues that have reported those kinds of symptoms.
It's interesting because you do hear people talk about how after the second shot, they'll have more symptoms.
Yeah, I think that's been what we've been seeing, and that was reflected in the clinical trials as well. It kind of speaks to the mechanism in which these vaccines work. So the mRNA vaccines, 2 doses. The first dose kind of primes the immune system, and then that second dose is really what we consider like the booster dose. And that really is what ramps up the immune system to crank out those T cells and antibodies. And that's where we see the secondary effects of the fatigue. But that's really a reflection of the immune system kind of hard at work responding to the vaccines as it should.
A 74-year-old woman on our Facebook page named Helen said that she is 74 and she's afraid of this. Should she be?
So, I think what we've seen is that these vaccines given to folks of all ages, older individuals, now we've given them to many individuals in skilled nursing facilities. And we've really been focusing on our 75 and older population here in Connecticut. And in terms of what we're seeing, we aren't seeing a higher rate of secondary effects. In fact, it seems to be that the younger individuals tend to develop more of those secondary effects. So, I think it's important to think that, if you do get any of these symptoms, they're short-lived. They usually last for about 24 or 48 hours, and they resolve. People go back to their usual, baseline level of function, level of activities. And that's been seen in the older individuals too. Again, important also to recognize that these symptoms are expected. It's not a reflection that the vaccine has caused an infection with COVID-19. These are not live vaccines. They don't have, the mRNA vaccines don't have any virus in them. They can't, cause you to be sick from the infection. It's really just your immune system ramping up.
It's interesting you mentioned that because someone actually just posted here, should they quarantine after getting the shot? They say that they were actually told by someone that they should because you may potentially be contagious. Is that so?
So, I think when it comes to the vaccine itself, there wouldn't be any associated risk of becoming infected or being contagious from the vaccine. What we do caution is that, and we can talk about this in a little bit more detail, but after getting the vaccines, we still have to maintain some of those measures, the masking, the distancing, particularly until you've completed that second dose of the vaccine. Unfortunately, we've had individuals who, after their first dose, maybe a day or two afterwards, became sick with COVID-19, and quite frankly, they were probably exposed and infected even before they got their vaccine. So really important that after you get the vaccines, particularly through the two doses, you maintain your high level of vigilance in protecting yourself.
Yeah, we keep hearing that really for months ahead, while everybody keeps getting their vaccine, to keep doing the social distancing and all that. Gina is asking us on Facebook, what's the difference? So this is a great question, I think, because I think a lot of people are confused, especially with the news about this J&J shot. What is the difference between the Moderna and Pfizer vaccine and now the Johnson & Johnson vaccine? Because when that new shot from Johnson & Johnson, which I understand obviously isn't approved yet for use, they're talking about how it may be less effective. So a lot of people have questions about what is the breakdown here for real.
So first, let's talk about the two mRNA vaccines, the Pfizer and the Moderna. And these vaccines are far more alike than different. So they work using the same type of mechanism. Basically, you get vaccinated with a little bit of that little code that helps to make that protein that stimulates your immune system. There's no virus involved with these vaccines. They generate a very robust immune response and very protective in terms of what we saw in the clinical trials. There's slight differences in terms of the dosing schedule. The Pfizer vaccine is 2 doses 3 weeks apart. Moderna is 2 doses 4 weeks apart. There's some slight differences also with the handling of the vaccines. Both vaccines require very special cold temperatures. The Pfizer, especially for its stability, requires ultra cold freezing temperatures. So subtle differences in that regard, but really much more similar than different. The J&J vaccine is a little bit different. It uses the same principles as the mRNA vaccine, but kind of a slight modification to the way that the vaccines work. So instead of actually receiving the mRNA itself in the vaccine, you receive what's called a viral vector. So a virus called adenovirus that is engineered to not be replicating, not cause infection, actually carries a little bit of that genetic code into the cells, and then the cell makes that protein to stimulate the immune system, just like the mRNA vaccine. So slight difference in the mechanism of the way that it works. I think the fortunate thing about that is that it's much easier to store and to transport. It doesn't because it's not mRNA itself. It doesn't require those special cold temperatures and some of the challenges that we have with storing and transporting the mRNA vaccines. It's also been demonstrated to be effective with a single dose vaccine, and that's really important, and that's a potential game changer in a lot of ways. The 2 doses can be challenging, and we know that there's going to be some limitations with that. But by having a 1-dose vaccine available, I think that really does, allow us to provide vaccine to a much larger population much easier. So, I think it's an important advance. As you mentioned, it's going to be reviewed by FDA in about 2 weeks or so, and we're hoping for authorization similar to what the process for the mRNA vaccines to occur, shortly thereafter. But we'll have to see.
Obviously, another weapon really in the fight. Does it matter which one people take? Should people say, if you go to the CVS at some point and they say, oh, here's the Johnson & Johnson, should you say, you know what, I would prefer the Moderna? Or is it really just a matter of take whatever you can get?
Yeah, interesting question. At this point, at least between the 2 mRNA vaccines, I think they're exactly equivalent. I wouldn't have one preferential over the other. There's no indication of that based on the clinical trial data. Or even what we're seeing now that we're administering these to millions of people. So between those 2 vaccines, there's really no difference. Whatever vaccine you have access to, you should go for it. With regard to the J&J vaccine, at this point, we don't have any guidance from the data to suggest that this vaccine may be preferential in one population versus another. But until we see the full data that's made available to FDA, I don't think we have any definitive conclusions. It's a possibility that there may be some specific guidance for the J&J vaccine once it becomes available, that it may be administered to one group of people preferentially over another group. We don't know that yet. But I think we'll have to stay tuned. But in terms of the mRNA vaccines, whichever one you can get access to, I'd encourage you to get.
All right, that's good to know. Liv is asking on our Facebook page, can I take the vaccine if I'm pregnant?
So good question and really important one. So, I think it's important to realize kind of what we know and, the information that we just don't have available yet. So in terms of the phase 3 clinical trials that were done for the mRNA vaccines, they excluded pregnant women. And that's very common for vaccines, especially vaccines when they first roll out, to not include pregnant women. So we don't have the concrete data on pregnancy. What we do know is that based on the science and the way that these vaccines work, there isn't a suspicion that there would be any potential harm to mom or baby when these vaccines are given to pregnant women. So we don't have any clear concerns from that perspective. I think that pregnancy is not a contraindication to getting the vaccines, and every person, especially pregnant women, should really have that discussion with their obstetrician, and it takes into account a lot of factors, and one of those factors would be what's the overall risk of getting infected with COVID-19. We know that COVID-19 and pregnancy does cause more severe illness, and pregnancy is a risk factor for becoming sicker if you do get infected. So I think we do have to take that into account. So at this point, not a contraindication, but a discussion to have with an obstetrician looking at the entirety of the picture for each individual woman.
There is some talk of folks online right now, one individual saying that they had COVID and they're still going to get the shot. They should still get the shot, right?
Yes. So a history of COVID infection is not a reason not to get the vaccine. In fact, if you become eligible based on your age or these other criteria, there's no reason not to get the vaccine. In fact, it's still encouraged. I think that the question is whether or not the immunity from a natural infection or is comparable to the vaccine-induced immunity, both in terms of the amount of immunity that's provided and also the duration that immunity provides. And that the vaccine may increase both of those, sort of the level of immunity, but also the durability of that immunity. So right now, the recommendation is if you've had COVID to still go ahead and get that vaccine once you meet the criteria to do so.
Absolutely. Lisa is saying, I have an overactive immune system with autoimmune disease. Am I at higher risk of any side effects from the vaccine?
So good question. This is something that comes up a lot. Based on what we know from the clinical trials, there is no contraindication for anyone with an autoimmune disease to proceed and get the vaccine once it's indicated. So we are giving it to folks who have a history of autoimmune condition, right now there's no contraindication based on that.
Okay, I just want to point out, a viewer asked here, they'll be 65 and can they sign up? And I know that the date to start signing up if you're 65 is tomorrow. So that is good news. I know the governor addressed that on Monday.
Yep, that's correct. So tomorrow we officially open up to 65 and older. And I think I'm really excited about that. I think that's going to be really impactful.
That's certainly good news. Diana's on Facebook asking, how safe is the vaccine if I have a heart condition?
So, I think in terms of safety, there wouldn't be a reason to think that someone with a heart condition would be at any risk in terms of safety from the vaccine. Remember, these are not live viruses. They won't cause someone to become sick with COVID. And the real concern with folks with some of these medical conditions like heart conditions, diabetes, that if they actually do get infected with COVID, the risk of requiring hospitalization is really higher in that group and really getting sicker. So I think all the more reason to focus in on those individuals that have heart conditions or diabetes. And when we move down the road with vaccination, we start to look at younger populations with high risk medical conditions. Heart disease is likely to be one of those conditions that we're actually going to be particularly encouraging vaccination among that group. Because we know about the harms of individuals with those conditions when they get COVID.
It's interesting, Doctor. I know you want to talk about some of the myths of the vaccine, and someone made some, you probably hear a lot of crazy comments. So, people read all kinds of things online. What do you say to these people who think it's, voodoo juice, as this guy called it, or, I'm not touching it. You can't trust these pharmaceutical companies.
Yeah, I mean, I can understand the challenge with all the information that's out there. It's confusing. We sometimes have a hard time teasing out what's real, what's not real. What I can tell you is that the data that we have from all of the clinical trials that have been done are really supportive. They really show that these vaccines are effective and that they're safe, and that we're really going to need this in order to protect ourselves and protect the community at large. So when you're looking for sources of data that are reliable, the CDC has really amped up its website with regard to information on the COVID-19 vaccine, and our Connecticut Department of Public Health as well is really a really good website describing the vaccines, both in terms of safety and efficacy, but also how Connecticut is doing in terms of getting the vaccines out there to the population. So those sites are reliable, they're vetted, and they really have the most accurate scientific data that's out there.
Really is incredible when you think about, I know we talked about this a few minutes ago, how far we've come in a year. Everyone in some ways or another has educated themselves so much on this because we really had no choice. It's impacting everyone, everywhere, all the time.
Yeah, it's been tremendous. I mean, having a global pandemic, and at this point, there's so many millions of infections throughout the world. We all now know people who have been infected. Unfortunately, a lot of us know individuals who have gotten really sick, maybe even have died from COVID-19. So it's affected all of us in our personal lives and in our day-to-day activities. And like I said, I think we are starting to really get a good understanding as to what works in terms of prevention, how to focus those prevention efforts, and the vaccine is going to be so critical in being able to turn this around.
Yeah, that is for sure. Someone's asking about high blood pressure. Is that a concern if you have high blood pressure?
So, I think, as I mentioned earlier with the heart conditions, these kinds of conditions we know put people at higher risk for becoming sick if they do become infected with COVID. Even more the reason to get vaccinated to protect yourself. So, in terms of safety from the vaccine, there aren't any specific vaccine-related concerns relating to heart conditions or high blood pressure. But really, those individuals should be the focus of our vaccine efforts to really, prevent them from developing severe infection.
Seeing the side effects from someone who is diagnosed with COVID, I'm sure has been very remarkable for you over the past year. One of them that gets talked about so much is losing smell or losing taste. I'm assuming Kim from Meriden has had COVID because she's asking if her taste and smell will ever come back.
So, that's a really important question. It's something that, is somewhat very new with COVID. We've seen that with other respiratory viruses at a much lower frequency. But with COVID, the frequency at which this is happening is quite striking. And, we've seen a lot of variability in terms of return of taste and smell. Some folks, their taste and smell returns within a few days. Others take months. It's hard to predict, unfortunately. It's going to be so individualized. My hope is that her taste and smell will come back soon because, that can really be very distressing to lose taste and smell. It's one of those effects that, even though it doesn't seem as dangerous as something requiring hospitalization or lung disease, can really be tremendously impactful. And we see it in young, healthy individuals too. So I think even more reason for all of us to get vaccinated, no matter whether we have some of those high risk conditions based on our age, based on medical conditions. Even young and healthy people get these kinds of secondary effects like the loss of taste and smell, which can be tremendously impactful.
My sister's in her 40s and she had COVID around Thanksgiving and she's doing fine, thankfully, but she said that that's how she knew. She lost her taste and just said it was the most bizarre thing she's ever experienced. No matter what she ate or drank, there was just absolutely no taste whatsoever.
Yeah, it's very striking. A lot of people that's the one of the very few or only symptoms that they come in with when they get diagnosed. And as I mentioned, most recover relatively quickly. Some do take longer, but I think it's quite variable from person to person. And that's the one thing that's been so remarkable with COVID in general. We see people coming in with all different kinds of symptoms. But some of whom are very mild, some of whom are very sick in the hospital. So it really runs the full spectrum. It's been very remarkable.
I know we've kind of bounced around here, but I want to go back to a pregnancy-related question that we just got. Rhiannon is asking if you contract COVID after shot number 1. Well, actually, this is not the pregnancy-related question. Let me ask you the pregnancy one. Kathleen is asking if you can get the vaccine at any pregnancy stage.
As I mentioned, there's no contraindication per se with pregnancy in terms of getting the vaccine. There wouldn't be a specific timing per se that's recommended for someone who's pregnant in terms of receiving the vaccine.
Okay, perfect. I know we had talked about pregnancy a few minutes ago, and if anyone is just joining us right now, I just want to mention they will be able to just rewind this and they can watch the whole thing from the beginning. It's been a fascinating conversation with you, Dr. Banach from UConn Health. Now to Rhiannon's question. If you contract COVID after shot number 1, is it still safe to have shot number 2?
So the current recommendation is that if you get COVID at any point in between the shots is to go ahead and get that second vaccine. I think we know that that 2-dose vaccine series really maximizes the amount of immunity. There may be some influence with having COVID in the middle, but at this point, there isn't a safety concern about it. So it's still being recommended. I will point out that that's an area in which there's ongoing data collection and study in terms of looking at people who have had COVID and the effect of giving them the first dose. How much immunity do they get from having COVID and then receiving 1 dose? It seems to be quite high, but still an area of ongoing study. And maybe down the road we'll learn more, and that'll change our recommendations. But right now, the recommendation is to get the 2 doses after having had COVID infection at any point.
Nancy from Glastonbury is asking, is it okay to take Tylenol or maybe even Advil before or after you get the vaccine? I know a lot of people are turning to that right now.
Great question, because a lot of people anticipate getting some of those symptoms afterwards. So, the general recommendation is to treat the symptoms when they occur. So, if you do get symptoms afterwards, taking Tylenol would be a benefit. Only a percentage of people who get the vaccine actually do get those symptoms, so it's certainly not all. In fact, not even the majority get those symptoms. So doing pre-medication, I think, maybe kind of jumping the gun. The other concern out there is that by giving pre-medication, there might be an impact on the amount of immune response that you get. So remember that the immune response that you get that causes the fatigue, the aches, is actually a good thing. You want to get some of that. If you block that, there's a possibility it may impact the strength of the immune response that you get, and then that'll affect the overall amount of protection that you have afterwards. So we're not recommending pre-medication, but if you do get to the point where those symptoms occur, then taking Tylenol to help relieve those symptoms is what's recommended.
Well, Dr. Banach, before we let you go, I just have to ask you, generally speaking, what is your message to everybody? We saw today on the news, there was a Super Bowl parade in Florida, and huge crowds of people with no masks. That has to be incredibly frustrating to you as a physician and someone who's lived through this over the past year. What would you say to people and urge them to do, even after they get that vaccine over the next few months?
So, I think the pandemic has affected us all tremendously. We've learned so much. We know how the virus spreads. We know what we can do to protect ourselves. Even very easy things like wearing a mask it can be really beneficial in terms of protecting ourselves and the community, protecting those around us. I'd encourage people really to think about how far we've come, that we know that these measures work. We know that we're seeing right now in Connecticut, we're seeing COVID rates drop, and that's really encouraging. We're also seeing vaccine rollout, which is also going to be really critical in terms of really turning the corner on COVID. So, as people are getting vaccinated, we're really trying to build up that immunity amongst all of us here in Connecticut, throughout the country, really getting as many people protected as possible. And that's also going to drive down the rate even further. So, I think in the meantime, while we're doing that, sticking to our protective measures, wearing the mask when we're out, particularly in indoor environments where we know that the virus spreads much more easily, is going to be critical. Trying to keep that distance, and really kind of being patient as we start to get that level of immunity in us and those around us, while driving down that transmission rate is going to be key. So I think the next few months are going to be really critical. We didn't really talk about other topics like those variants that are occurring, but as we learn more, I think we need to kind of take the information as it comes, do everything that we can to protect ourselves and all of those around us. And that'll help us, really bend the corner on COVID-19.
Well, sounds like there's reason to be hopeful, and I'll take that. That's for sure.
Absolutely.
Dr. David Banach from UConn Health, thank you very much for joining us right here on Facebook Live. And with everybody, from all of us here at Channel 3, we want to thank you and all of your colleagues at UConn, because what you all have been doing on the front line is just remarkable over the past year. So we can't say it enough, but we certainly appreciate it.
Well, thanks for the kind words, and thanks again for having me on.
Take care, Doctor. Thank you.
You too.